Well, what a joy it is to be with you. Thank you so much. What an honour it is to address an Australian Christian Lobby event. I'm just back from a few months in Europe, and I tell you what, things aren't fantastic in Australia, excuse me. But in those countries in Europe which don't have the equivalent of the Australian Christian Lobby, they are much, much worse. And we have our challenges here, but we're doing better here than most countries in Europe. And part of the reason is because of you good folks and the fantastic work that ACL does. And it's an honour for me to be associated with you. I so much enjoyed the last part of that address. I mean, I think it's a terror that we all have that one day people are going to think we have no value. So that was fantastic. Now, the topic that I'm going to talk to you today about is my book. That's very strange, isn't it? You'll be astonished to hear that. And because, as you know, a life of journalism generally produces in people an outlook of sanctity, an angelic disposition. You're not sceptical about that, surely. And one thing that we never suffer from in journalism is a conflict of interest. You know, we're never talking our own book, so to speak. This book was a bit of a trauma for me in a way. I mean, it was a joy, really. It was great fun. You know, being a journalist is terrific fun. It's a very self-indulgent profession. I am very scared that one day, when I'm up for consideration before the pearly gates and the other option, there'll be a certain interrogation which says, so you basically enjoyed yourself like an undergraduate for 45 or 50 years. People paid you for this, and you're claiming this was a life well lived of work, you know. That's one of the reasons I think I chose to write this book. But another reason was I've been a journalist now for 40 years and a professional full-time journalist. And in that time, I've seen the culture move from being nominally pro-Christian to then being kind of neutral to now being, I think, aggressively anti-Christian. Although I think it is better in Australia because there are groups like ACL which fight. And we don't win every battle, but it's much better to fight and lose than not to fight and lose. And of course, you won't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. So if you don't fight, you're never going to win, for sure. I must say also, being essentially an Irishman, we're accustomed to long centuries of defeat. And this is the normal. But the great thing is, the faithful never die. And you never give up the fight. But going public, as it were, this book involved my going public as a Christian. So there was a certain intellectual reason for this and a certain personal reason. The intellectual reason was that I think more and more now, those people who are Christians in our society ought to own up to it and say so publicly. I mean, it is a very anti-Christian time, but we're not persecuted in the way that Christians are in Pakistan or the Middle East or Africa. And if we don't own up to our beliefs, I think that's cowardly. And I think Christians benefit from solidarity, and so they benefit from other people expressing the solidarity with them. The other reason, of course, was that I think, you know, as you get a bit older, you think, well, maybe it's time to do something for God, you know. I might be having an encounter with him quite soon, and I'd like to have something on the positive ledger, you know. And now, of course, there were a lot of hesitations, not only my natural bashfulness and shyness and discomfort in any kind of public role, but you know, after 40 years of journalism, it would be absurd to present yourself as any kind of model. So you don't want Christianity judged by your own life. That would be very, very damaging to Christianity indeed. And part of the book was interviewing a few politicians, and I found that a number of politicians, most politicians go into public life from a sense of public service, and a number of them at the end of their career embrace holy orders. Lynn Arnold, a former Premier of South Australia, is an Anglican minister. Michael Tate, a former governor, a former minister in the Keating government, is a Catholic priest in Hobart. These are genuinely deeply motivated Christian men and so on. I couldn't, in all my researches, find a single journalist who, after 40 years in journalism, found himself well equipped for a life in holy orders. There were quite a lot of renegade priests who'd left the priesthood and come into journalism. That was pretty common, but the other way round was very unusual. And so that's a long-winded way of saying a certain sense of my own moral infirmity was making me reluctant to come out as a public Christian. As I say, I've led a fully rackety life, which embraces every aspect of all the various experience that you'd expect for someone who's been 40 years as a journalist. And so I knew I was absolutely morally unqualified to talk about Christianity. But then I realised that also can be an excuse for cowardice. And indeed, if we leave the defence of Christianity only to the morally qualified, it's going to be a pretty small platoon. It'll be you good folks in this room and not many others, So I thought I'd join the raggle-taggle militia heading along the sidelines. It was also the case that my last book, my sixth book, I'd been to a whole lot of writers' festivals, Byron Bay and Sydney and Melbourne and so forth. I must say, in Byron Bay, as a moderately conservative person, I felt like a half-domesticated orc dragged in from the hills to hold company with a crowd of very worried hobbits who nonetheless, while they were tolerant, had their pike staffs and were ready to deal with the orc if. Having said that, everyone was very nice to me and so on. I mean, I was an oddity. I was an absolute oddity. I think I was the only orc there, but nonetheless, people were very kind to me. So good on them for being so broad-minded. But what struck me with all these writers' festivals, where I saw hundreds and hundreds of books being promoted and being talked about, there was not one book in favour of Christianity. There was hardly a book which mentioned Christianity at all. It was as if we'd been completely whited out of the culture. Yet, even according to the census, if Australia is a nation of 25 million people, there are 13 or 14 million self-identifying Christians in Australia, and say 10% of them or 15% of them are more or less church-going, that's a couple of million people. And yet, they weren't to be found represented anywhere in these book festivals. So I thought, let's try to do something about that. And you can't change the whole culture with a single thing. Well, maybe you can if you're Billy Graham or something, but generally you can't. But at least you can make a little contribution. So you can add your thimbleful to the great ocean of discourse, and then you make the ocean a little bit different. Now, in my book, I wanted to do several things. I wanted to take a first principles approach to Christianity to answer some key questions, and then I wanted to look at how some Christians live. Now, I took the C.S. Lewis approach of trying to find the mere Christianity consensus. So the book is absolutely non-denominational. I'm not saying denominational differences are of no account, but the book is non-denominational. It looks for that, for anybody really who can recite the Apostles' Creed and mean it. And the book deals with Pentecostals and evangelicals and self-identifying Baptists, Coptic Christians, Eastern Orthodox, Catholics, and so on. Really, anyone who felt they could sign up to the Apostles' Creed, I was happy to examine their beliefs and write about them. I am steadfastly non-denominational, and one fantastic thing is that the denominations are no longer hostile to each other. Everybody is a friend. We used to have the Irish disease where we would agree on 99% of everything and then fight furiously over the 1%. We're past that now. You know, we're in a wartime situation and we can't choose our friends too carefully. But while I am profoundly non-denominational in this book, and I tried not to argue one doctrinal point or anything against another, I must say I am very attracted to one particular doctrine which very few of you folks will hold to, and that is the doctrine of purgatory. You know, if you're a journalist, I'm sure you all know what purgatory is. Purgatory is the place where you go where you're going to maybe sneak in, but on the very last ballot. You know, instead of a normal election, it's been made into a double dissolution, and so the quota is halved, and the preference flows have gone just right, and there's an outside chance if the Court of Disputed Returns rules the right way, you might just get the last place, you know. So I find purgatory a very comforting place, and it would be my hope that I find as many friends there, especially from my professional life, as possible, and that you good folks will be looking down on us from above and saying, okay, you know, take a year off his sentence, you know. But so that's the only denominational doctrine which I cling to. But I want you to know it doesn't figure much in the book. It's just a personal preference. So the book is called God is Good for You, A Defence of Christianity in Troubled Times. And it has a secular publisher, Allen and Unwin, and I must say they did a wonderful job. I think there'd hardly be a person in the whole firm which agrees with everything in the book. There might not be a person in the whole firm who agrees with anything in the book, but they couldn't have been better or more dedicated or, you know, worked harder to make the book a success, which is fantastic of them. And I've found actually that the more you own up to belief, the less trouble you have with people. When you're trying to make this secondary utilitarian case that, look, you don't have to believe Christianity is true, but it's good to follow its ethics anyway, that is actually much less appealing to people than to say, guess what, this is very exciting, this is true. The other thing is, I think it appeals to conservatives of a certain age, you know, people of my age, to say Christianity may not be true, but its values and traditions have been very beneficial to society, so let's not throw them away. But what young person could you possibly inspire with a message which said, now I want you to live your life according to these precepts, which are based entirely on falsehoods, lies and superstition, and have no bearing in reality whatsoever? I think that's a losing proposition. Now, of course, it's also untrue, but it doesn't even have the benefit of being pragmatically useful. So I wanted to answer a few questions in this book. As a culture, are we losing God? The answer broadly is yes. We're not going to lose God altogether, but as a culture, we are losing God. Western Europe is more atheist than we are. A number of Western European nations, including Britain, are already majority atheist nations. We're about 50-50, and the United States is more religious than we are. But all three, Western Europe, Australia and New Zealand, and North America, are all showing the same trends of decline. At the same time, there are tremendous shoots of new life. So an old church is dying, a new church is being born, and there are great signs of new life. But I think we have to be honest about the fact that our numbers are in decline, and we need to address that circumstance and work hard to recruit and to change. Now, many people, Nicky Gumbel of Holy Trinity Brompton and Archbishop Fisher, the Catholic Archbishop of Sydney, have pointed out to me that Christianity has been at a low ebb before in the West and in Australia. In 18th century London, Nicky Gumbel was telling me there were 10,000 sex workers walking the streets, and at Easter service at St Paul's Cathedral had 17 people attending. Archbishop Fisher has told me about times in the 19th century when the Christian observance rate in Australia was much lower than it is now. So we shouldn't think that the past was always one of full belief. Every generation, every person needs to be converted in every lifetime. It's always the task ahead of us. Then I wanted to ask the question, what do we lose as a culture if we lose God? I think we lose morality. Even the most secular philosophers, the most honest ones, Richard Dawkins and Peter Singer, will admit if there is no God, then there is no basis ultimately for morality. If you say, your dream is as good as my dream, follow your dream. What if your dream involves killing 600 people or having sex with 6-year-olds? What is the ultimate authority that says that dream is no good, that dream is morally wrong? There is no authority. The only thing that mediates behaviour then is power, just power. And so you get into a very brutal circumstance. As well as losing morality, we lose purpose. I'm greatly influenced by the writing of Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychiatrist who survived Hitler's death camps. He said the thing that all human beings need more than anything else is meaning in their lives. And the experience of the death camps did not drive him away from religious belief, it drove him towards religious belief. When he was in the camp, he would contemplate his wife who was in another camp, and that was consolation enough. And he understood for the first time the biblical passages about the angels lost in heavenly choirs of adoration and contemplation, because all he wanted to do was to contemplate the image of his wife in those circumstances. And a people without a purpose becomes very dangerous. And of course, we lose truth, because in the end, the belief in the absolute reality of God tethers all other belief in truth and falsehood. If there is no absolute, then just as there is no absolute standard of morality, there is no absolute standard of truth. The truth of God underpins all the other truths. The human mind can argue itself into any level of subjective madness. That's what the whole postmodern phenomenon is all about. Because it's untethered from its roots, it goes mad. Another question the book asks, is belief in God reasonable? Well, of course, it's compelling. It's more than reasonable, it's compelling. So, one act of penance I did, which is going to shorten my term in purgatory, is that I actually read the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, all the rest of them. And what a load of tedious codswallop it really is. I couldn't believe what junk it was. I mean, I'd been reluctant to read it, thinking, well, you know, there might be something challenging here that I can't answer or something. It's kind of baloney, really. It doesn't really make an argument. It trots out some old 19th century arguments and dresses us up with a lot of irrelevant science. For instance, Richard Dawkins spends 100-page telling you that the universe is 14 billion years old, as though that's a slam dunk case against God. Whereas, of course, it's characteristic of everything we know about God that he would spend 14 billion years preparing a beautiful gift just for us. And if Richard Dawkins, that might be not in Richard Dawkins' scale, but who is he to say it's not in God's scale? There's no logical argument here. It's not an argument of reason. It's just an argument of mockery. Similarly, one of the arguments he makes is that God is unlikely. And he then has to confront how unlikely human life is. It's unbelievably unlikely. You know, if the Big Bang had been a little bit stronger, all the planets would have dissipated. If it had been a little bit weaker, they'd have fallen back in the sun. You have to have carbon to develop life, and the development of carbon is very eccentric, very particular. The conditions you need for life to come about are extraordinarily unlikely to occur naturally. All sorts of mathematical equations have to be just so, and so on. And it is unbelievably unlikely. In fact, the nicest interview I had on this book was with Richard Glover, one very nice guy, an atheist broadcaster on the ABC, who said to me, you know, Greg, on page 58, you almost had me. My wife was very worried when you talked about how unlikely life is. And Dawkins' explanation of it is to go to Stephen Hawking and say, well, plainly, there are an infinite number of universes, and we just lucked into the one which produces life. So he can't believe in God, which the vast majority of humanity has always believed in, and the vast majority of humanity alive today, incidentally, believes in, everywhere but the West. But he can invent an infinite number of universes with no evidence. It's just popped into his head. It's a crazy idea. It's incredibly unlikely. There's no evidence of any intersection between these universes. This is magical thinking. And atheism requires infinitely more magical thinking than belief in God does. But what's happening in our present culture is that Christians are being bluffed out of their beliefs. They're being told all the time that nobody believes anymore, no scientist, which is untrue, no rational person. So part of the subtext of this book is to show people in the latter part of the book, where I'm dealing with the lives of specific Christians, that the brainiest and cleverest people, as well as ordinary folks, do in fact believe in Christianity. There's no object to Christianity in reason. The wonderful philosopher Roger Scruton argues that while you can get to God through reason, nonetheless you can't absolutely prove God, and I accept that. I'd agree with that. It requires faith, but it's not unreasonable. Just like believing that I'm the son of my parents requires faith. I've never proved it. My parents are dead now. We never had a DNA test. I suspect they're probably telling me the truth. I have faith in them, so it's a rational belief, but it's not a proven belief. And most of the things we believe in life are rational but not proven, and we believe them because of our faith in the people who tell us them. But Roger Scruton argues that the most powerful human evidence for God is the long human experience of God. And the atheists won't admit this experience. But of course, if you were having an investigation in a court of law, you would call testimony from people all the time. And you'd get this overwhelming human testimony from the vast majority of the 6 billion people alive on the planet today, and the overwhelming majority of people who have ever lived, about the experience of God and God in their lives. And that, I think, is the strongest piece of evidence. And the second half of the book, where I'm dealing with some expressions of Christianity in human lives, I place Pentecostals and the Benedictine monks in the same chapter because they're so obviously so similar. And I must say, I had great enjoyment with both the Benedictines. So the Benedictines are experiencing an astonishing revival in Australia. There are new monasteries. When I say an astonishing revival, 20 people or something, but that is astonishing when you consider what the Benedictine life is. It's a renunciation of all normal pleasures in life and an embrace of a life of contemplative prayer, basically singing the Divine Office, the Psalms, for the rest of your life. But I spent a lot of time with them, and I spent a lot of time with the Pentecostals. Someone in ACL, in fact, put me in touch with the Planet Shakers in Melbourne. I think the Planet Shakers are fantastic. I fell in love with them. I think they're absolutely great. The fabulous music. But two things were similar about the Benedictines and the Pentecostals. The first is all of their music is based on the Bible. The Benedictines spend their life chanting the Psalms. All of this fabulous, beautiful music that the Planet Shakers produce, 90% of it seems to be Bible verses put to a rock and roll idiom. Now, rock and roll was a bit new for me as church music, but it was very well done. It was very, very well done. But the second thing is they are both experiential. A monk leads a life of mystical union with God, strange mystical experience. That's what sustains a monk through 60 years of devoted life. And the Pentecostals leap into the experience of the Holy Spirit. Head first, they just jump into it, and with full confidence and no safety net. And like everybody else, they make their mistakes, but they're fantastic. So I love them both. And I thought, these are expressions of the same Christianity, Bible-based and experience-based. But that's not to disparage any other form of Christianity. I profile evangelical parishes in Perth, which are fantastic, and of course my own tradition, Catholic movements, Campion College in Sydney, which some of you will be familiar with, and what we call new ecclesial movements, Focolare, a movement of lay people trying to live out the gospel. unusually for a Catholic movement, always to be headed now by a woman, so that, not for a gender reason, but just so that a priest can never run it. So it's a worldwide movement with millions of people and lots of priests, and always headed by a woman. Then I also wanted to answer the question in the book, what do Christians actually believe? Like the average, amateur Christian, I had a pretty good idea of what I believed, but I wanted to work it out in a bit more detail, and I did that just by using the Apostles' Creed. Let's go through the Apostles' Creed. Now then, like a lot of slack Christians, I hadn't spent enough time in the Bible, so I had to really come to grips with the Old Testament. And what fun the Old Testament was. So I had a whole chapter on the Old Testament. The Old Testament is great. It is just great. It's so much fun. I mean, I don't want to sound heretical here, but it's almost kind of more fun than the New Testament in a way. This is just as it struck me. I'm not making a doctrinal statement there, but the Old Testament, you'd have to say, is written more in the style of the Sydney Daily Telegraph than the Australian. Has great stories, had great sub-editors. It always names names. There's almost nobody anonymous in the Old Testament. You can see the sub-editor saying, no, don't tell me this man on the mountain. What was it? Moses. All right, okay. And that always answers when, who, why, where and how. Short, gets to the point, and great humour. So I concentrated on a few books. It was very important to do this, I think, because Richard Dawkins and a lot of the other atheists constantly defame the Old Testament, say that the God of the Old Testament is a God of power and misogyny and ethnic prejudice and genocide and ethnic cleansing and so on and so on. All rubbish, of course. The Old Testament is full of magnificent wisdom and moral beauty. Be kind to the strangers, for were you not also strangers in Egypt? What the Lord requires of you, O mortal, is to live justly, love tenderly, and walk humbly with your God. But I concentrated on 3 books in particular. I wrote a lot about Genesis in the stuff about creation, but Ruth, Jonah, and Job. What a great story Jonah is. What a fantastic story. Jonah is the most brilliant Mel Brooks comedy in the ancient world. It's fantastic. There's Jonah. He hates the Ninevites, and God says to him, okay, Jonah, go and preach to the Ninevites and get them to convert. Jonah says, I don't want to do that. I don't want them to convert. I want them to suffer the fate that they deserve. God, like a stern editor-in-chief, says, no, look, Jonah, I've told you what your assignment is. Go and do it. Jonah, like a good journalist, takes his expenses and goes on a cruise. And believe me, this is not unknown in the world of journalism. In fact, I think if I was assigned to Nineveh right now, I might... Anyway, God... editors-in-chief have a way of just reaching out and finding you, and so Jonah gets flung into a whale and he has a storm at sea and he's 3 days and very unpleasant, so he says, all right, I'll go. And then, like Mel Brooks theatre producers in the movie The Producers, they want to produce a musical which is going to fail, so they produce a musical called Springtime for Hitler, and it's a success. Well, Jonah is exactly in the same circumstance in Nineveh. He's preaching to these buggers and they repent, and he's so unhappy about it. What? Oh no. And he comes back and he says, look, God, I told you what had happened. These horrible Ninevites have repented and now they're going to avoid the fate which they richly deserve. And God says, Jonah, you did a good job. Well done. You can have some long service. And Jonah goes off into a terrific sulk. He's inconsolable. He's very much like a journalist, Jonah, I tell you what. And of course, Jonah has a magnificent, serious message that even in the Old Testament, God is a universal God. He's the God of the Ninevites as well as the Israelites. It wasn't necessary for the Ninevites to convert to Judaism to avoid their fate. It was simply necessary that they repent of their licentious and evil lives. But what a rollicking, brilliant tale. What fun, what an act of criminal vandalism it is to deprive our young people of this but to make sure they have to go through safe schools or something, you know. It's, then Ruth, of course... thank you. Ruth, of course, is the greatest short story that I've ever read. Just an astonishing piece of literature. Leaps out at you 2,500 years later. You just can't put it down. It's an extraordinary, wonderful tale. And the book of Job, perhaps the most inexhaustible and extraordinary book in the entire Bible. You just can never come to grips with its richness. You can never exhaust it. The most profound meditation on innocent suffering in the history of human literature and human thinking. And the writing on Job, the secondary writing, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, G.K. Chesterton, the people who've written essays about Job, it's absolutely inexhaustible. But in the end, of course, Job never loses faith in God, and God never loses faith in Job. And one of the many lessons we learn from Job is that the innocent suffer as well as the wicked, and that suffering is not a sign of wickedness. Anyway, it was great fun writing about the Old Testament. Then I wanted to deal directly with the problems of Christianity. I think you've always got to take your enemy's strongest arguments. The problem of evil, why does a good God allow evil? The problems of the innocent suffering, why are there 2-year-olds suffering cancer? And then the problems of the sins of Christians. Of course, across 2,000 years, Christians have done lots of bad things. Being an adherent to Christianity doesn't absolve you of the human condition and all its frailties. So I wanted to deal with those face to face. Then the history of Christianity's contribution to our modern political culture. You know, there's a Disneyland view of Christian history which says the first followers, Jesus was a kind of social worker or political activist, a kind of Jewish Mahatma Gandhi, and the first followers were okay, but then Constantine came along and made Christianity a state religion, and everything was corrupt and evil until the human race, at about the time of the Enlightenment, learned to reject Christianity and put human beings at the centre of things, and mankind has gone forward ever since then. And of course, it's completely wrong in every single aspect. Everything we like about modern political life and modern liberalism grows organically out of Christianity, not as a rejection of Christianity. What did we get from Christianity? We got human dignity. Genesis told us that human beings were made in the likeness of God, the most radically pro-human rights statement in the ancient world. And then Christianity came along with its absolutely universal message. There is neither Greek nor Jew, slave nor free, male nor female, we're all one in Christ Jesus. Slaves had immortal souls, younger sons had immortal souls, women had immortal souls. Christian families didn't abort or murder their baby girls, so they had a lot more daughters than pagan families. As a result, they were a lot happier, and naturally the girls converted the pagan men they married who became Christians. And because all men know that the secret to a happy marriage is to do as you're told. And secularism came from Christianity. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God that which is God's. Democracy came from Christianity. The separation of church and state, wrestling the concept of sin away from the concept of crime. So I spend part of the book describing that historic process. Then in the second half of the book, I look at the experience of particular Christians. I have 2 chapters interviewing politicians whom I knew had some Christian belief but had been too shy to mention it much in public. I cajoled, blackmailed, intimidated and ruthlessly forced them to submit to the interviews. You know, some of them were extremely reluctant. They'd ring me up and say, "Oh, mate, I'm so sorry, I missed your deadline." And I said, "Guess what? I'll make a new deadline just for you." But they all rewarded me with rich inner lives which they revealed. I was not interested in the effect that Christianity had on their politics. I was interested in what did they believe about their immortal souls. Did they pray? What was going to happen to them when they died? Did they think they were going to see their mum and dad again? And then the rest of the book is predominantly looking at Christian individuals and movements which are showing dynamism and new life. And I found that the movements which are most successful are the ones which have strong leadership, very clear beliefs which they proclaim without any embarrassment or trying to dodge the implications of their beliefs. and then which have a form of worship which in whatever way aesthetically reflects in the beauty of the worship, the beauty of the moral message. And then I finish up with a chapter suggesting how we move forward, which is that we have to conceive of ourselves now as a bold minority. We want to change society. We want to reintroduce Christianity as the predominant plausibility structure of society, but we're starting in a position where we are a minority. That makes you much more psychologically capable of dealing with the situation. Of course, you're not then surprised when your position is attacked, as you are if you think you're still defending an old social orthodoxy. And also, it means that we have the tactical advantage of being guerrilla insurgents. You know, we don't control many towns or bridges anymore. We just want to blow up the enemy's towns and bridges. It's a lot more fun. I mean, I speak to you as an Irishman, you know, and but it's a lot more fun. It's a lot more fun. And of course, as a minority, you can claim minority rights. And when Christians do this, they're claiming minority rights for the truth. So my final message is that the situation is desperate, but not altogether serious. And in a desperate situation, there's only one legitimate response: advance on all fronts. Thank you.